All right, folks. Today we want to go over logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are very important. They are basically flaws in logic, which people make when they're having an argument or when they're writing an argumentative paper. And you need to know logical fallacies because if you know them, you can A, avoid them, and B, call them out when other people are guilty of them, right? So we'll just go through, this is a list of 30, and we'll go through each one and I'll kind of explain it. I've got some examples that I've used here. These examples are from mostly my real world experience and discussions I've had in the past, although some of them I have made up for the purpose of the video here. But the first one is the straw man. And the straw man is one of the more common logical fallacies. It's when an opponent restates or recharacterizes your argument to be weaker than the one you actually made, creating a metaphorical straw man in the form of this weakened representation. They then attack the straw man instead of the actual argument you made. This is one of the more common fallacies that you will encounter. So here's my example. After hearing Jeff's strong argument about the legalization of medical marijuana, Jim rebutted, while my opponent seems to believe that the anarchistic legalization of narcotics is a boon for our society, I myself have a much more nuanced and reasonable position. This is the straw man fallacy because Jeff was only arguing for the legalization of medical marijuana, not the anarchistic legalization of narcotics, which is obviously a much less favorable position. Instead of straw manning your opponent by making their arguments weaker, you should rather steel man them by granting them the strongest and most generous form of their position, even to the point of helping them fortify it. Then, by refuting the steel man, you show your position to be truly superior, right? So don't try to weaken their argument and play word games. Help them out, make it stronger, and then rebut it. Because when people see that, they're like, oh, wow, he's actually really well versed in this position and his view is more favorable. All right, the next one is the slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy is when someone concludes that society's movement in a transformative direction, usually towards something seemingly minor or benign, will result in much worse consequences further down the line. While it is true that some forms of social change do lead to greater changes, sometimes even destructive ones, this fallacy is usually engaged in the absence of a clear logical progression from A to B to C, and is intended to make the initial proposition seem much more consequential than it actually is. All right, here's the example. Embroiled in the gay marriage debate of the early 2000s, Jim said that Jeff's pro-LGBTQ stance was a slippery slope, stating the next thing you know, people will be marrying animals. Later, he went on to reference an instance in India of a woman marrying a cobra, ignoring the fact that this was done as a religious gesture. This is the slippery slope fallacy because the union of two consenting adults is very different from the marital union of a human and an animal. To say that one will lead to the other is not based in a logical assessment of the situation. That may seem like an absurd example, but I actually remember it from when I was in high school. There was a newscaster who said that pretty much in those words. All right, number 3, the hasty generalization. The hasty generalization fallacy occurs when someone reaches a conclusion before having all of the facts at hand, usually out of a preferential bias for a certain outcome or position. The example is looking forward to his company cornhole tournament that afternoon as he stepped out of his apartment. Jeff concluded that the weather would be nice all day because the sun was shining and there were few clouds. However, if he had bothered to consult the weather app on his phone, he would have seen that a storm front was rapidly approaching and thus had the good sense to bring his raincoat. In argumentation, if a person fails to research a position thoroughly, perhaps for fear that their preferred stance will be disproven by the greater body of information, they are guilty of this fallacy. Okay. The next one is post hoc ergo propter hoc. You're going to see a lot of these are in Latin, right? This is a Latin phrase that means after this, therefore, because of this. It refers to the assumption that because one event precedes another, the preceding event must be the cause of the subsequent event. However, this is often not the case, as a clear causal relationship between the two events must be established before we may assume that they are connected. Example, because of the disastrous Hurricane Katrina occurring in the wake of the New Orleans Pride Festival, the Reverend Jerry Falwell saw this as conclusive proof that the hurricane was caused by the festival. This is a fallacy because it assumes a magical connection between the two events that cannot be established logically. And again, belief is fine for your personal life, but you need to be able to demonstrate clear logical connections between things once you're working in the realm of argumentation. Number 5 is the genetic fallacy, right? The genetic fallacy holds that if something has unsavory origins, then it should not be considered. This fallacy is common in politics, where an idea or position will automatically be rejected or opposed with little consideration for the facts or arguments, simply because it originates from some political boogeyman or morally tainted circumstance. Example, because the Volkswagen auto company was created by Hitler, Jeff concluded that nobody should ever buy a Volkswagen car. This is a genetic fallacy because the company no longer has ties to Nazi ideology or individuals, and the car itself has no tangible association with fascism beyond its increasingly distant origins, right? Just because Volkswagen came about due to the Fourth Reich does not mean, or the Third Reich, sorry, which Reich was it? It does not mean that you should not buy a Volkswagen. Number 6 is begging the claim. Begging the claim occurs when someone embeds or validates their desired conclusion within the claim itself. Example, the horrific and unethical practice of snipe hunting should be banned nationwide. This is begging the claim because the claim itself asserts that the practice is horrific and unethical, which is therefore assumed instead of proven. For those of you who don't know, snipe hunting is a gag that people play. There is no such thing as a snipe. So if anyone ever takes you on a snipe hunt, they're pulling your leg. All right, number 7, circular argument. Asserting a premise that is based on itself is called circular reasoning or a circular argument. Example, when pressed by accusations that its claims were far-fetched, the Church of Scientology claimed that its premises were true because the writings of L. Ron Hubbard said that they were true. This is circular logic because they are basing the truth of the writings on the writings themselves. This is actually more common than you think, right? Circular reasoning or circular argument. Number 8 is the either or, also called the false dichotomy. The either or false dichotomy fallacy occurs when an individual confines the possible approaches to a subject into 2 categories, which are often diametrically opposed and designed to force compliance by making one premise seem more favorable than the other. Example, during the Iraq War, Jeff made the statement that either you are for the war effort in Iraq or you are against the troops. There is no other option. This is the false dichotomy because it ignores a third possibility that one could be against the war yet also in support of the troops, which is arguably the most logical position, right? Because if you're in support of the troops, naturally you want them to be safe. All right. Number 9 is ad hominem. It's another Latin phrase. It means simply attacking the person instead of the position or the argument. Here's the example. Enraged by Jim's articulate rebuttal of a mandatory toothbrushing law, Jeff responded by saying that Jim was a rock-banging troglodyte with nothing worthwhile to say about personal hygiene. This is ad hominem because Jeff insults Jim rather than refute his position. All right. Mandatory toothbrushing is a position held by Vermin Supreme, who is a presidential candidate. Very funny guy. Number 10, ad populum, the bandwagon fallacy. All right, so the bandwagon fallacy is, you could probably infer from the name, it's the assumption that the truth of a position is directly correlated to its popularity. While consensus, particularly among scientists and academics who have a whole process of self-review that's based on facts and evidence and this whole, clear-cut process, while that can give credence to a position, it's also possible for the masses to be dead wrong. It's possible for science and scientific consensus to be wrong, but it's especially possible for the masses to be wrong in the absence of that process. So here's my example. It's a little bit long-winded, but after giving his treatise on the infinite universe and innumerable worlds, renowned philosopher Giordano Bruno was angrily refuted by his fellow academics, who claimed that everyone and their dogs believes the stars are but lights placed in the sky simply to light the earth at night. So why would anyone believe that each star was its own sun with its own solar system? This is the bandwagon fallacy because while it was almost universally agreed during Bruno's time that the stars were but lights for the earth, Bruno's position was eventually proven correct, demonstrating that the unpopular notion can indeed be correct. Number 11 is the burden of proof fallacy. The burden of proof fallacy states that the duty of proving a claim falls on the one making it. Inversely, it is not the job of others to refute a claim that has little or no sufficient evidence. Okay, so there's actually a really great example that was created to demonstrate this point. It's called the flying spaghetti monster. When arguing for the existence of a flying spaghetti monster that created the cosmos, Jeff stated that since Jim could not disprove the existence of a flying spaghetti monster, it was therefore safe to assume that such a monster existed. This is the burden of proof fallacy because unless Jeff provides evidence of such a creature, there is no good reason to believe it exists. It is not Jim's job to disprove something so baseless and absurd. This one happens a lot. Like, you can't disprove the existence of Bigfoot. Well, no, you can't. But, well, I mean, it's, you would have to scour every square inch of uncharted forest, right? So it's not your job to do that. It's the other person's job to show that there's good reason to believe there's a Bigfoot. Trust me, I want to believe in a Bigfoot. I don't want anything more than believing in Bigfoot. I think it would be the coolest thing that ever happened. But until I see the evidence, I'm going to hold out on that one. Number 12 is red herring. A red herring is a diversionary tactic, which involves diverting attention to an issue with only surface level relevance to the topic at hand. The name red herring refers to the use of stinky herringfish in the training of bloodhounds and other tracking dogs. The smelly fish was used to teach the dog to ignore distracting smells, such as delicious festering garbage, a delicacy to most dogs, when searching for a missing person. Right, so they would plant the fish in certain places, and then they would teach the dog not to go to the fish. Ignore the smell, find the person, right? So it's a distraction tactic. Here's my example. When confronted with questions about connections between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the late Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Gates responded that his foundation had done more philanthropic work than any other in the world. This is a red herring because Gates' emphasis on philanthropy is meant to distract from the difficult question he has been asked, right? And again, these are based on real events. I'm just going to leave that there. Number 13, false equivalency or moral equivalency. So the false equivalency or moral equivalency fallacy occurs when two things that are equated based on only minor connections or similarities. The example is, fed up with his demanding art teacher, Jeff claimed that because the art teacher and Adolf Hitler were both vegetarian painters, they were equally as detrimental to civilization. This is fallacious because basing such an assertion on minor similarities such as diet and hobby interests ignores the immense body of evidence, such as the Holocaust, demonstrating that Hitler was in fact a far worse person than Jeff's overbearing art teacher. Number 14 is the sunk cost fallacy. And this occurs when, despite ample evidence that something isn't working out, an individual continues to pursue it out of fear that all of the time, energy, and resources spent will be lost unless they can turn things around. This usually results in an even greater loss of time, energy, and resources. All right, so here's my example. Because Jeff had already fixed the transmission, AC, and turbo injectors on his truck, he continued to replace parts rather than get a new car, even to the point that the repairs became more expensive than a monthly note for a reliable vehicle. This is the sunk cost fallacy because Jeff assumes that abandoning his truck will mean that all of the previous work has been lost, when in actuality, he's costing himself more energy and resources in the long term. We just don't want to give up on things sometimes, especially when we spent a lot of effort on them. But sometimes you have to see the writing on the wall and realize that the sunk cost fallacy is not worth your time. Number 15 is the appeal to emotion or pity. So in the argumentation lectures, we talk about ethos, pathos, logos, and how you want to use emotion. But emotion is a fallacy when it is used to the detriment of logic. Too much emotion can destroy the logic of an argument. So here's my example. Despite the invasive and destructive habits of wild boars in the American Southeast, Jeff argued that the poor little piggies could not help their nature, and so nothing should be done to curb their destructive impact. This is a fallacy because the emotional appeal or appeal to pity for the pigs is used to generate sympathy for an illogical position, one that leads to further environmental destruction for the numerous native species that the pigs threaten, like turkeys and quail and a lot of the ground-dwelling birds. They really can't survive an abundance of pigs. So by using emotion to support the pig, you're actually destroying the species that have more of a environmental right, if such a thing can be said, to live there. Number 16 is the causal fallacy. This fallacy occurs when a correlation is mistaken for a causation, when in actuality the relation is coincidental. Right, so here's the example. Because one study showed that a majority of people with face tattoos have some kind of criminal record, Jeff concluded that getting a face tattoo made one more likely to commit crime. This is the causal fallacy because while face tattoos are an extreme fashion statement frequently adorned by ex-cons and inmates, there is nothing about getting a face tattoo that will magically make someone into a criminal. The relationship between these two things is correlative and not causal. All right, number 17 is to coke, which is Latin for you too, and it's the appeal to hypocrisy. To coke is Latin for and you also, and refers to the appeal to hypocrisy fallacy that is often used to deflect salient criticism of a person or position. Example, in the presidential debate, Vermin Supreme accused Joe Exotic of misusing his campaign funds. Rather than answer this charge, Joe Exotic counter-accused Vermin Supreme of spending a disproportionate amount of his own campaign finances on Ben & Jerry's ice cream. This is the to coke fallacy because rather than answer the charge, Exotic deflected by emphasizing Supreme's alleged hypocrisy. Well, Vermin Supreme spending money on ice cream doesn't mean that Joe Exotic didn't misuse his funds, right? That was used as a deflection tactic, an appeal to his hypocrisy. It's what you say to your mom when she accuses you of stealing the cookie from the cookie jar and you accuse her of sneaking Twinkies in the night. Yeah, that may be true, but she's the adult, you're the kid, you shouldn't have stolen the cookie, case in point. Number 18, Texas sharpshooter. Sharpshooter, okay. To put it plainly, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy occurs when an individual cherry picks information to prove their position while ignoring evidence to the contrary. The name for the fallacy references a Texas man who shoots a wall and then draws the target around the bullet hole to make it seem as though he has hit the bullseye. Example, when arguing that the earth was flat, Jeff chose to use information only from the Flat Earth Society's homepage and ignored anything to the contrary because it was too mainstream. This is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy because Jeff only selects information that supports his position, right? Anyone that can control the flow of information can convince you of anything. If you're not hearing the full discourse, if you're not seeing all of the evidence, both pro and con, then you are being manipulated in some way, and usually by the Texas sharpshooter. Number 19 is the no true Scotsman fallacy. The no true Scotsman fallacy occurs when someone, having been presented with an example that contradicts their claim, denies that the example is a true representation of the thing about which they have made the claim, thereby moving the goalposts. The fallacy was named for the statement from philosopher Anthony Flew used in the example below. Example, no true Scotsman puts brown sugar on his porridge. The fact that Angus McGregor puts brown sugar on his porridge just proves that he's no true Scotsman. People will do this anytime you give an example that sort of refutes a claim. They will come up with a condition whereby your example is not sufficient, right? It's not a real X and Y. It's not a real Scotsman, right? When in actuality, they just don't want to, in most cases, they just don't want to confront the fact that you've just proven them wrong, right? Number 20, personal incredulity fallacy. The personal incredulity fallacy occurs when someone uses their own misunderstanding of a topic to make the topic seem outlandish or absurd. Example, when countering Jim's arguments in favor of evolution, Jeff replied, what? Do you expect me to believe that a monkey just magically turned into a human being? This is the personal incredulity fallacy because evolution does not argue that monkeys magically turn into human beings, but rather details how random mutation and natural selection create genetic changes over large spans of time. So at the very least, you have to confront what the theory is actually saying if you want to try to argue with it. If you're going to make it seem like they're arguing that things just change into other things for no reason, then that's obviously your own incredulity. You don't understand the issue, and that's why you've mischaracterized it. Number 21 is special pleading or the goalpost fallacy. Very similar to the no true Scotsman, but instead of refuting a specific example, it just changes the definition of the thing to exclude whatever you have given as an example. So the special pleading or goalpost fallacy occurs when someone moves the goalpost or makes an exception when someone provides an example which proves the claim to be false. Example, a renowned historian made the claim that the idea of alchemy as an internal or spiritual science is a product of modern psychoanalytic philosophy and has no basis in the Renaissance. When given several instances to the contrary, the historian reframed his original statement to the idea of alchemy as an internal or spiritual science has no pervasive basis in the Renaissance. So by including that one word pervasive, we've now altered the definition that was given to exclude any evidence to the contrary, which is a fallacy. It's a tactic. Okay. Number 22 is composition and division fallacy. The composition and division fallacy occurs when someone assumes that that which is true for the part is also true for the whole. So example, Jeff learned in physics class that atoms were so small that they were invisible. Therefore, Jeff concluded that because he was made of atoms, he was also invisible. He was subsequently arrested for trying to rob a bank in the nude. Right? I think I'm funny. I don't really care if you guys do. All right. Number 23, appeal to nature, the nature fallacy. The nature fallacy occurs when someone argues that something is favorable because it is natural or a part of nature. I'm sure you've heard this one before, right? This is a fallacy because while nature does produce things that are beneficial, such as herbal medicines and things like that, it also produces many things that are horribly deadly and poisonous, such as arsenic, amatoxin, cyanide, etc. People who equate nature to goodness are operating under an idealized bias and therefore guilty of a fallacy. Example, when Jeff's teacher caught him smoking cigarettes after class, he responded that this behavior was acceptable because American Spirit cigarettes were made of all natural tobacco and thus were ultimately good for him. You know why this is a fallacy. Jeff is now dead. Number 24, the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy rests on the false notion that in a sequence of random events, the probability of one event is dependent on another, specifically the previous event. This is called the gambler's fallacy because gamblers often place their bets based on outcomes that have happened previously. Casinos will even show the sequence of outcomes on roulette tables to encourage people to bet on numbers that are, quote, due. In reality, the odds of any given outcome are the same every time and unrelated to what came before. Example, having flipped a coin 3 times and gotten heads, Jeff knew that the next flip had to be tails because it was overdue. As such, he bet Jim that if he could correctly guess the next flip, Jim would owe him lunch for a month. And if he guessed wrong, then he would owe Jim the same. The flip came up heads because the odds were always 50-50 despite the previous occurrence of 4 heads, and Jeff's bank account has yet to recover. Number 25, the fallacy of ambiguity. It's basically when you try to use ambiguity or ambiguous language, unclear language to avoid accountability. Example, Jeff's father told him to wait at home while I run to the corner store. When he got back, however, Jeff was gone. Hours later, when Jeff returned home, he was confronted by his father for the disobedience, and he claimed that while watching his father head to the corner store, he could see that his father was walking instead of running, and so he assumed that meant he could leave whenever he wanted. Right? I'm going to run to the corner store. Well, you weren't running; you were walking. That's obviously the fallacy of ambiguity. He's using the language to get around the command. Number 26, anecdotal fallacy. The anecdotal fallacy occurs when someone uses their own personal experience as evidence of a statistical fact, which we all do on some level. I think this is how most human beings shape their perception of their reality. But in reality, individual experience and accounts are not valuable in determining trends or commonalities because the possibility exists that your subjective experience is the anomaly and things work out differently in the majority of cases. Example, while fishing in a drainage ditch near the Atlanta Zoo, Jeff was bitten in the face by an enormous reticulated python. When asked by Jim later if he wanted to go fishing with him, Jeff replied, "Hell no, I'm never fishing in Georgia again. If you go fishing in Georgia, you'll be bitten in the face by a reticulated python." Despite the obvious absurdity, Jeff ignores the fact that his experience, though valid, is extremely unlikely to occur for other people, as the presence of the massive snake was an anomaly due to the close proximity of the zoo to that specific drainage ditch. Number 27, the fence sitter or middle ground fallacy. The fence sitter or middle ground fallacy occurs when, usually as a peacemaking tactic, someone proposes a compromise between two diametrically opposed positions when one is clearly more favorable than the other. Example, Jim and Jeff were arguing about the COVID vaccine. Jeff said that the vaccine seeded people with lizard DNA, whereas Jim maintained that Jeff's approach was not based in any evidence. As a compromise, Tony suggested that only the Pfizer vaccine contained lizard DNA, whereas the other variations did not. This is a fallacy because analysis of all the vaccine brands showed that lizard DNA was not an essential ingredient, and Tony inadvertently gave credence to a lie for wanting to mitigate between his two friends. Okay? Number 28 is the loaded question. The loaded question occurs when someone asks a question that is innately defamatory and or produces a lose-lose situation for their opponent. Example, after seeing Jim out for coffee with a girl they both fancied, Jeff approached them both and asked, "So, Jim, how was rehab?" As was Jeff's plan, the coffee date ended shortly thereafter due to the loaded question he had posed to subtly defame Jim. All right, number 29 is the appeal to authority. While appealing to authority can strengthen arguments in the presence of scientific evidence and methodology, it becomes a fallacy when the appeal to authority is either cherry-picked deviation from a soundly proven consensus or the specific authority of the individual in question does not align with the specific area of expertise. Example, when confronted with the overwhelming evidence that vaccines do not cause autism, Jeff referenced a single study from the 90s claiming that its author was credentialed and established as a medical researcher. However, Jeff's appeal was based only on the authority of the author and ignored the fact that the study had demonstrably flawed methodology and had been replicated and debunked countless times. People still share this study today. You may have seen it. Someone will share the vaccines cause autism study. That is debunked. It's been debunked a million times. It was published in the 90s. They've replicated it a billion times. It's proven wrong. But people see that. They see it's a study. It was published by a researcher, so it must be true. That's not how that works, right? Appeal to authority is only valid when it's backed by consensus and evidence. When you just make the appeal to authority based on just someone having a status as a doctor or whatever, that's not exactly a sound way to do that. Also, it may surprise you, but Bill Nye is not a credible scientist. I know. I can hear your disappointment. He is an engineer. He's a mechanical engineer, which means he knows science, and I do think he's qualified to be a science communicator. But if you were writing a science paper and you cited Bill Nye, you would technically be wrong because the area of specific expertise, i.e. mechanical engineer, does not match up to something like evolutionary biologist or whatever scientific field, right? Chemistry, physics, he probably is good to go, but you start getting away from that, it becomes an issue. Number 30, the fallacy fallacy. The fallacy fallacy occurs when someone, I love that, fallacy. When someone catches someone else in a fallacy and thus concludes that their premise is correct. While it is always in your best interest to point out fallacies where they reveal themselves, doing so does not necessarily mean your position is stronger or correct. All right, the example. While arguing whether or not corporal punishment had a positive effect on children, Jim resorted to the ad hominem fallacy by characterizing Jeff as, quote, an abusive monster that no one should listen to. After calling him out for ad hom, Jeff took his victory lap, assuming that he had won the debate. However, the body of available scientific literature clearly shows that corporal punishment tends to do more harm than good. So even though he had committed a fallacy, Jim was still correct, right? So it doesn't mean that you're wrong. It's still a good idea. Still makes your premise look stronger. But again, it's all about the facts and what we can prove and what we can show. And then again, my little dry humor here, I have this quote. Yo, dog, I heard you like to fallacy. So we put a fallacy in your fallacy. So you can fallacy while you fallacy. And that's exhibit, probably. Probably not. Okay, so these are the 30 logical fallacies. Please study and commit them to memory. It's very important stuff. And I will see you all next time.